Long before the vampire learned to dress itself in velvet and moonlight, fear already knew its shape. It lived in the silence after burial, when the soil had barely settled and the name of the dead was still spoken in the present tense. In small villages stitched together by fields and forests, death was not distant or ceremonial. It slept in the next room. It lingered in the breath of the sick. It waited patiently at the edge of every winter. Nightfall did not bring rest, it brought questions. In a world without electricity, darkness was absolute, an engulfing presence that erased landmarks and softened certainty. When the sun fell away, so too did the fragile order of daylight. The dead were no longer safely contained in memory or prayer. They felt closer then, nearer, as if the earth itself might exhale them back into the world. Burial was meant to be an ending, a sealing of boundaries, but the grave was shallow, the rituals imperfect, and the ground unforgiving. Rain collapsed fresh soil, animals disturbed the edges, and sometimes when graves were reopened, out of necessity or suspicion, the body did not look as it should have. To modern eyes, these signs are familiar: swelling, darkened lips, blood pooling in the mouth, the slow work of decomposition misunderstood by those without anatomy or science. But to the medieval mind, the body was not merely flesh, it was a vessel of meaning, a final testimony. And when that testimony contradicted expectation, it whispered of something unfinished. Villagers did not ask whether the dead could rise, they asked why this one had not stayed down. Death was everywhere, but it was not abstract. Children learned its contours early. Mothers watched it claim infants before names had time to settle. Fathers carried the weight of fields and funerals in the same week. Life was short, fragile, and relentlessly physical. So when something disrupted the expected stillness of death, it did more than frighten. It violated a fragile agreement between the living and the buried. The line between those states, alive and dead, was never firm. Illness blurred it. Comas, fevers, and seizures could mimic death's quiet. Mistaken burials were not rare. The fear of waking beneath the soil was not metaphorical, it was practical. To be buried alive was a fate worse than dying twice. And so, when someone died suddenly, violently, or without witnesses, unease followed them into the ground. People listened for sounds at night, they watched the doorways, they counted the livestock. They measured the health of their neighbors, looking for patterns. Fear, when shared, becomes a language. In these early centuries, the dead did not belong entirely to the past. They remained participants in the present, through inheritance, memory, and guilt. A wronged ancestor could curse a lineage, a restless spirit could sour crops or bring sickness. The grave was not a wall, it was a thin veil. And sometimes it felt porous. When unexplained deaths followed a burial, suspicion found its target easily. Someone had not gone peacefully. Someone was feeding, though they no longer breathed. The idea did not feel irrational, it felt inevitable. The vampire, in this earliest form, was not a creature of seduction or malice. It was a symptom, a response to patterns that demanded explanation. When families sickened one by one, when children wasted away in their sleep, the cause could not be invisible. It had to be intentional, personal. Hunger, after all, is easier to face when it has a mouth. Graves were opened not out of cruelty, but desperation. The living sought proof, and they found it, because they did not yet know how to read the language of decay. A body that seemed full, flushed, or wet with blood was not resting. It was active. The grave, rather than containing the dead, had become a threshold. These discoveries hardened belief into certainty. The dead stirred because something had summoned them, or because they had unfinished appetites of their own. In these villages, faith and folklore were not separate disciplines. Prayer existed alongside precaution. Crosses were placed not only to honor the dead, but to restrain them. Stones were laid in mouths, limbs were pinned, bodies were turned face down so they might dig deeper rather than upward. These acts were not born of superstition alone. They were acts of control in a world that offered very little of it. The living feared what they could not govern: disease, famine, sudden loss. The dead became vessels for those anxieties, given form and intention so they could be confronted, punished, or destroyed. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something more intimate. Grief does not end cleanly. It lingers, it echoes. To imagine the dead as restless was, in some way, to refuse their absence, to believe they still moved, still hungered, still existed somewhere close, just beyond the firelight. The vampire was not merely a threat, it was a presence. A reminder that death did not sever bonds as neatly as theology promised, that love, resentment, and obligation could outlast the heartbeat, that the earth did not always keep what it was given. Night after night, villagers listened to the dark and wondered if the soil was truly enough. They did not imagine castles or immortality. They imagined footsteps, scratching, breath where none should be. The vampire at this stage was not a legend, it was a possibility. And possibilities are more frightening than monsters, because they ask us to look at the world we know and admit how little of it we truly understand. In those early centuries, when the dead stirred in rumor and fear, humanity stood at the edge of explanation. Without science, belief became the bridge between observation and meaning. And on that bridge, something took shape, slowly, imperfectly, inevitably. Not a creature yet, not a story fully formed, just a question whispered into the dark soil. What if death is not the end? And what if some part of us refuses to stay buried? Chapter 2. Hunger without a body. The earliest vampires were not defined by fangs or blood, but by emptiness. They were not hunters in the night, nor creatures of ambition or malice. They were something far more unsettling, an absence that pressed itself into the living world, a hunger without hands, a desire without breath, an appetite that had lost its body yet refused to die. In the centuries before doctrine hardened belief into Scripture, people understood hunger intimately. It shaped the calendar, the seasons, the fragile balance between survival and collapse. Hunger was not metaphorical. It was a force that hollowed faces, stilled villages, and drove entire communities into memory. To imagine hunger surviving death was to imagine fear unending. In a world where the soul was thought to leave the body cleanly, the idea that desire might linger felt like a violation of the natural order. Death was meant to quiet the body's urges, to still the cravings of flesh and bone. But what if it did not? What if the grave only stripped away restraint? This question haunted early folklore long before the vampire had a name. The dead were believed to carry forward what defined them most in life. A greedy man might rise still grasping. A jealous lover might wander searching. A glutton might hunger endlessly, no longer limited by digestion or decay. Desire, once unmoored from the body, became terrifying precisely because it could not be satisfied. An appetite without fulfillment does not fade, it sharpens. Early accounts of revenants speak less of violence and more of depletion. Livestock sickened, milk soured, families weakened in ways that felt gradual, draining, like something was being taken slowly, invisibly, night after night. This was not predation, as later centuries would imagine it. It was consumption without contact. Blood, in these early beliefs, was not merely a substance. It was vitality itself. warmth, breath, the visible proof of life moving through the body. To lose blood was to lose presence in the world. So when the dead were said to drink it, the act was symbolic as much as physical. They were reclaiming life because they had none of their own. The vampire did not want to kill, it wanted to exist. This fear of lingering desire cut deeply into the medieval understanding of morality. Christianity taught that the soul would be judged, purified, or condemned, but folklore asked a quieter, more troubling question. What if judgment was not immediate? What if something human remained unfinished? The vampire became a warning not about evil, but excess. Those who lived with too much attachment to food, to sex, to wealth, to control, were suspected of carrying that imbalance beyond the grave. Desire, once indulged too deeply, might anchor the dead to the living world like a chain. And chains, once forged, are difficult to break. This belief shaped burial practices across Europe. Corpses were restrained not because they were feared as attackers, but because they were feared as seekers. Mouths were stopped to prevent feeding. Bodies were weighed down to suppress wandering. Graves were sealed with care, not to honor the dead, but to starve them. Starvation, after all, was a language everyone understood. The idea that something could hunger without a body also reflected a deeper psychological terror, that the self was not whole, that the mind and the flesh could be separated, leaving behind a fragment that remembered what it wanted, but not why it wanted it. In this sense, the early vampire was less a monster than a broken human impulse. It embodied the fear that we are not governed entirely by reason or faith, but by craving, blind, persistent, and capable of outliving us. It suggested that death did not cleanse the soul, but stripped it down to its most compulsive need. And that need, once freed from consequence, became monstrous. Villagers told stories of the dead sitting on the chests of the living, draining strength through proximity alone, of shadows lingering near beds, of exhaustion that came without cause. These were not tales of attack, but of erosion. The vampire fed the way hunger feeds, quietly, patiently, leaving only weakness behind. Such stories mirrored the lived experience of famine and disease, tuberculosis, anemia, wasting illnesses that hollowed bodies slowly, making victims look consumed from within. Without understanding microbes or pathology, people turned to metaphor, and metaphor took form. The vampire was the explanation for depletion that had no visible wound. It was the answer to why the strong grew thin, why children faded, why life seemed to leak away even in times of peace. An unseen appetite made sense of invisible suffering. But beneath the fear lay recognition. Hunger is universal. Desire defines the living. To imagine it surviving death was to confront something uncomfortably familiar, that we are shaped less by virtue than by longing, that even when the body fails, the need might persist. In this way, the vampire was not entirely other. It was exaggerated humanity, stripped of balance. It was what happens when want is no longer checked by flesh, community, or consequence. As centuries passed, this formless hunger would acquire a body, teeth, hands, a face. But at its origin, the vampire was nothing so concrete. It was a pressure in the dark, a sense of being diminished, the quiet terror that something was taking what it could not replace, an appetite that could never be filled. And perhaps that is why it endured, because long before it drank blood, the vampire fed on something deeper, the human fear that desire does not die when we do, that some part of us, once awakened, may hunger forever. Chapter 3. Graves that would not rest. The grave was meant to be final. a closing of earth over flesh, a promise that what had ended would remain ended. Yet for many centuries that promise felt fragile, dependent on soil depth, weather, ritual, and the patience of the living. When graves were shallow and rites hurried, the earth did not always keep its silence. Sometimes it answered back. In villages where death arrived often and without warning, burial was not always careful. Winter frost hardened the ground, summer heat hastened decay. Epidemics overwhelmed priests and families alike, forcing the dead into the soil with prayers cut short and rituals left unfinished. The living did what they could, quickly, before the next body demanded attention. But haste leaves questions behind. When misfortune followed a burial, when illness spread, livestock weakened, or neighbors died in troubling succession, attention turned backward toward the grave. Suspicion did not arise from malice. It arose from pattern. Something had changed after the burial. Something had begun. And so, the dead were sometimes called back into view. To open a grave was to cross a boundary few wished to approach, yet necessity has a way of dulling fear. The earth was dug away slowly, reverently, as if the soil itself might object. What lay beneath was expected to be still, reduced, neutralized by time. But bodies do not obey expectation. When the coffin lid was lifted, villagers often found a form that seemed alarmingly alive, the abdomen swollen as if full, the skin darkened, taut, the mouth stained with blood that had risen from the lungs as gases built within the chest. Fingernails appeared longer, hair thicker, illusions born of receding skin. To the modern mind, these are signatures of decay. To the medieval eye, they were signs of activity. Something had happened after burial. The body, rather than wasting away, seemed to have grown, to have fed. Blood at the mouth was not read as the byproduct of internal pressure, but as proof of consumption. The grave had not starved the dead, it had sustained them. This was the moment where fear hardened into certainty. The grave that would not rest was not merely disturbed, it was violated from within. In a world where knowledge came through observation and inheritance rather than experimentation, the corpse was a text to be interpreted, and its language was misread through the lens of dread. Each unnatural detail confirmed what the living already feared, that death had not ended the story. The idea of decomposition was not yet formed. Rot was not understood as a process, but as a condition, one that should look passive, diminished, emptied. When the body contradicted that image, the contradiction demanded explanation. An explanation inevitably turned toward intent. The dead had fed in the dark. These discoveries did not happen in isolation. They occurred in communities already strained by hunger, disease, and uncertainty. When a corpse appeared unnaturally preserved, it felt less like coincidence and more like cause. The dead had drawn something from the living world, strength, blood, breath, and in doing so had left absence behind. Absence is easier to fear when it has a source. Graves became suspect places, not resting sites but thresholds, portals where something might pass back and forth under cover of night. The earth, once protective, became unreliable. And so the living intervened. Bodies believed to be restless were altered. The mouth was stuffed with stones or ash to prevent feeding. The head was removed to sever intention. The heart was pierced, not out of cruelty, but out of logic. If blood was being taken, the source of desire must be destroyed. These acts were not born of savagery. They were procedures carried out with grim resolve. The living believed they were correcting a failure, repairing a burial that had not been enough. In this way, the vampire was born not from imagination, but from misinterpretation. a narrative imposed on the unfamiliar processes of death. The grave became a stage where biology was mistaken for betrayal. Yet beneath the misunderstanding lay something deeply human. The refusal to accept that death could look active, that it could mimic life in unsettling ways. The fear was not simply that the dead might rise, but that death itself was unpredictable, messy, and beyond moral order. A clean death reassured the living that the world still made sense. An unclean one threatened that belief. Graves that would not rest became symbols of disorder, proof that the boundary between worlds was thinner than promised, that ritual, faith, and intention might fail under the weight of reality. And so, folklore stepped in where certainty could not. Stories gave meaning to the unsettling. They turned confusion into caution. If a body swelled, it was because it fed. If blood appeared, it was because it drank. If death spread, it was because something had returned to claim more. These explanations restored a sense of control. Because if the dead were responsible, then the living could act. They could reopen graves, perform corrective rites, destroy what threatened them. In naming the problem, they believed they could contain it. The vampire, in this chapter of its history, was not yet a creature of the night. It was a diagnosis, a conclusion drawn from soil-stained hands and fearful eyes, a way to explain why graves refuse stillness. But something else lingered beneath the fear, a quiet recognition that the body does not vanish when life leaves it, that continues briefly, disturbingly, in ways that resemble vitality, that death is not a moment but a process, and processes are difficult to witness. To watch a corpse swell and darken is to confront the reality that life does not depart cleanly, that something continues even when meaning has fled. For the medieval mind, this continuation demanded intention, and intention demanded a name. Thus, the grave that would not rest became the birthplace of one of humanity's oldest fears, not of monsters, but of unfinished endings, of death that does not know when to stop, of the possibility that the earth itself might fail to hold what we bury, and that something swollen with borrowed vitality might be waiting in the dark soil, still feeding, still changing, still refusing to be still. Chapter 4. Disease in the blood. Long before disease had names, it had patterns. It moved through villages like a slow, deliberate shadow, touching one home, sparing the next, then returning without warning. It wasted bodies quietly, hollowing cheeks and dimming eyes, until the living scarcely recognized themselves in one another. There was no single wound to point to, no obvious cause to blame, only the steady disappearance of strength. And fear followed that disappearance like a second illness. Plague did not announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It arrived in coughs, in fevered skin, in children who did not wake. Wasting diseases lingered longer, crueler, draining breath and color over weeks or months, leaving behind forms that seemed already half buried. The afflicted were not struck down all at once, they were consumed. To live in such a world was to feel life slipping away from the inside. Without the language of microbes or circulation, sickness felt intentional. It chose its victims unevenly. It moved as if guided. When one person weakened after another died, the connection felt undeniable. Something had passed between them. Something had been taken. Blood, in pre-modern thought, was more than a bodily fluid. It was life made visible, warmth, spirit, the medium through which vitality moved. To lose blood through illness, injury, or unexplained weakness was to lose presence in the world itself. So when disease drained entire households, The explanation did not settle on chance, it settled on theft. The vampire in this moment became a figure of contagion long before contagion was understood. Not merely undead, but parasitic, feeding invisibly, leaving the living pale, breathless, diminished. The sick did not look attacked, they looked emptied. An emptiness demands a cause. Plague years carved deep scars into collective memory. Entire villages disappeared, bells rang without pause, graves multiplied faster than prayers. In such times faith alone felt insufficient. Prayer did not stop the spread. Repentance did not spare the faithful. The mind, faced with suffering that ignores morality, begins to search for intention elsewhere. Who benefits from this loss? Folklore offered an answer that felt both terrifying and logical: the dead. Those who had recently died, especially under strange or unresolved circumstances, were suspected of drawing life back from the living world. If the dead were weak in the grave, perhaps they fed to sustain themselves. If the living sickened, perhaps something had taken from them. Disease, reframed as predation, became understandable. This belief did not emerge from ignorance alone. It emerged from observation filtered through fear. Illness often struck families first, then neighbors. It clustered. It lingered near the recently dead. These patterns mirrored the imagined movements of a revenant far more closely than random chance. And so the vampire became an epidemiological explanation. It explained why proximity mattered, why sleep felt dangerous, why the night seemed to worsen symptoms. Victims often reported exhaustion, chest pressure, breathlessness, sensations that folklore translated into visitation. Something had sat upon them, something had fed. In this interpretation, disease was not impersonal. It was intimate, it knew names, it crossed thresholds deliberately, and because it acted with purpose, it could be confronted. Graves were opened again, not because the dead were hated, but because the living were desperate. The body of the suspected vampire was examined like evidence. Was it bloated? Was there blood at the mouth? Did it look too whole? If so, the conclusion was immediate. Life had been stolen from the village and stored in the grave. Rituals followed, piercing the heart, burning the remains, scattering ashes. These acts were not merely symbolic, they were attempts to stop transmission, to break a chain of suffering that had no other visible link. And sometimes, when fear receded after such acts, when disease waned naturally, as outbreaks often do, the belief was confirmed. The vampire had been stopped. In this way, folklore created a feedback loop between fear and coincidence. Natural disease cycles reinforced supernatural explanation. Each recovery became proof. But beneath the myth lay a deeper psychological truth. Disease stripped people of agency. It made bodies unreliable, breath shallow, strength temporary. In a world already precarious, illness felt like betrayal from within. To imagine an external thief, to believe something else was responsible, was, in a strange way, comforting. It meant the body had not failed on its own. The vampire externalized suffering. It transformed random decay into conflict. Victims were not merely unlucky, they were targeted. And the community, united against a common threat, could act together. Fear, when shared, becomes purpose. The association between blood and disease also reflected lived reality. Tuberculosis, anemia, and plague all produce the same visible signs: pallor, weakness, wasting. The sick looked drained, as if something essential had been removed. And so, the vampire fed not because blood was dramatic, but because it made sense. It was the clearest metaphor for what people could see but not explain. As centuries passed, medicine would uncover causes, bacteria, viruses, parasites. But long before that, humanity used story to map suffering. The vampire was one such map, drawn in fear and necessity. It gave disease a face, and faces can be confronted. Yet even as science advances, the imagery remains. We still speak of illness as something that attacks, invades, consumes. We describe exhaustion as being drained. We talk about vitality as if it could be taken. The language endures because the experience does. The vampire of disease was never just a monster. It was a reflection of how it feels to watch life fade without understanding why. To feel one's strength stolen by something unseen. To suspect that survival itself is being siphoned away. In that sense, the myth was not wrong, only unfinished. It captured the emotional truth of disease long before it grasped the biological one. And in doing so, it revealed something enduring about the human mind. When life disappears without explanation, we do not accept emptiness. We imagine hunger. We imagine theft. We imagine something in the dark, drinking what we cannot afford to lose. Because to believe that life can vanish without intent is far more frightening than believing it was taken. And so, in the age of plague and wasting illness, the vampire did not lurk in castles or shadows. It moved quietly through blood and breath, unseen, unnamed, stealing life from within. Chapter 5, The fear of contagion. Fear does not begin with death. It begins with closeness. In the centuries before disease was understood, before the invisible had language, communities learned a quiet lesson through loss. Danger did not always announce itself. It traveled softly, unnoticed, from one body to the next. It moved through touch, breath, shared meals, shared beds. It punished intimacy. And so, proximity itself became suspect. Villages were built on closeness. Survival demanded it. Families shared space, labor, warmth. Animals slept near humans. Wells were communal. Life was intertwined by necessity. But when illness appeared, that same closeness turned inward, becoming a liability. The sick were not merely unfortunate, they were dangerous. At first, this danger felt moral. Sickness was read as punishment or imbalance. But as outbreaks repeated, another pattern emerged. Those who tended the ill often fell next, wives after husbands, children after parents, neighbors after funerals. Something was passing between bodies. Without knowledge of microbes, people reached for metaphor, corruption, taint, miasma. The idea that something unseen could cross from one person to another and hollow them from within was deeply unsettling. It meant the body was porous, vulnerable, open. And what is open can be entered. The vampire became the embodiment of that terror, not as an individual monster, but as a mechanism. It explained why sickness moved, why it spread, why one death seemed to summon another. The vampire did not simply kill, it transmitted. It crossed thresholds quietly. In this understanding, the night took on new meaning. Darkness was when bodies rested, defenses lowered, breath slowed. It was when families slept together for warmth, when windows were shut, when the air felt heavy and shared. If corruption moved invisibly, night was its favored hour. Stories arose of the undead visiting homes without breaking doors, sitting on chests, breathing the same air, feeding not always through wounds, but through presence alone. The victim woke exhausted, weakened, altered. The language of these stories mirrors the experience of illness with unsettling precision. Contagion, without a name, found one in folklore. The vampire was feared, not because it was violent, but because it was intimate. It did not attack strangers from afar. It returned to those it knew, family, neighbors, the familiar. This made it more frightening than any beast, because it suggested that love and safety offered no protection, that the people closest to us could become the source of our undoing, not through malice, but through exposure. Communities responded by reshaping behavior. The sick were isolated, the recently dead were avoided, homes were marked, certain families became untouchable. Fear reorganized society quietly, efficiently. Rituals emerged to police boundaries: garlic, smoke, thresholds, charms, not because they were magical, but because they created distance. They marked separation. They reassured the living that something stood between them and what spread unseen. The vampire in this role was not just a monster, it was a warning. Do not get too close. The idea that corruption could pass invisibly also unsettled the spiritual order. If illness could be transmitted without consent, then virtue alone was not protection. Good people suffered alongside the wicked. Children died before sin could shape them. This randomness demanded explanation. Folklore answered by giving contagion intention. The vampire chose victims, even if its choices appeared cruel or arbitrary. It acted according to rules, returning to its own household first, feeding locally, spreading outward in rings of proximity. This mirrored reality closely enough to feel true. The fear of contagion reshaped how the dead were remembered. Once ancestors were protective presences. Now the recently deceased became potential threats. Mourning was complicated by suspicion. Grief was delayed by fear. To love the dead too closely was to risk joining them. Burial practices changed accordingly. Graves were placed farther from homes, bodies were sealed more carefully. Funerals became quieter, quicker. Touch was reduced. Distance became reverence. And yet, no amount of separation felt sufficient, because contagion did not respect walls. The vampire's power lay in this helplessness. It reminded people that control was partial at best, that no boundary was absolute, that breath itself could betray. In times of epidemic, fear spread faster than illness. Whispers replaced certainty. Someone had seen the dead walking. Someone had heard scratching at night. Someone knew which grave was responsible. Blame condensed around figures already marginalized: the foreign, the poor, the unbaptized, the strange. Those already kept at the edge of the community were easiest to push beyond it. The vampire myth offered a justification. It allowed fear to focus, to attach itself to a form, to transform invisible danger into a visible enemy. But the deeper fear was not of the undead. It was of one another, of the realization that survival depended not only on strength or faith, but on chance, on whether illness happened to pass through your home, on whether you stood too close to the wrong person at the wrong time. The vampire externalized this anxiety. It carried the blame for what no one could control. And in doing so, it preserved the illusion that safety was possible, if only the source could be found and destroyed. As knowledge slowly advanced, contagion gained a new language. Germs replaced spirits, transmission replaced feeding, but the emotional truth remained unchanged. We still fear closeness during outbreaks. We still isolate. We still mark danger zones. We still speak of disease as something that spreads, invades, passes. The old metaphors endure because the experience endures. The vampire was never just a creature of night. It was the story we told ourselves when we realized that danger could be invisible, intimate, and unstoppable. That death did not always come from afar. Sometimes it came from the breath of someone we loved. In that realization, humanity learned a new kind of fear, not of dying, but of touching. And so, long before science named contagion, folklore gave it a face, pale, quiet, moving from body to body, reminding us that closeness, the very thing that makes us human, can also be what undoes us. Chapter 6. Sin that survives death. Death was supposed to be an ending, not merely of breath, but of account, a final reckoning in which the chaos of a human life, its failures, excesses, and transgressions, would be weighed, judged, and resolved beyond the reach of the living. The grave, in this understanding, was not just a resting place, it was a moral boundary. But folklore has always been suspicious of clean endings. In the villages of medieval Europe, where everyone was known and nothing was forgotten, reputation did not dissolve with the body. It lingered, it clung. A life poorly lived left impressions that soil could not erase. And when fear pressed hard enough, those impressions took on form. Sin, people believed, did not always die when the body did. Those who lived beyond accepted order, who defied religious norms, violated communal trust, or existed at the margins of society, were rarely granted peaceful deaths in memory. Even in life they were watched. In death they were suspected. The vampire, in this chapter of its evolution, became a moral consequence. Not a random curse, but continuation, a punishment that felt fitting. Those accused of excess in life were imagined to rise as creatures of excess in death. The glutton fed forever, the lustful drained vitality, the cruel returned to torment the living. The monster reflected the accusation. This belief did not require evidence, it required alignment. The vampire was not discovered, it was recognized. When something went wrong after a burial, the question was not whether the dead had been sinful, but whether their sins had finally revealed themselves. And judgment followed swiftly. Religious doctrine reinforced these fears even as it tried to contain them. The Church taught of purgatory, of souls lingering between salvation and damnation. But folklore pushed the idea further. What if the soul did not merely wait? What if it acted? What if moral corruption animated the dead? In this worldview, the body became a vessel for unresolved sin, not sanctified, not absolved, but contaminated by its own history. Burial rites were meant to protect against this, to cleanse, to bless, to sever the soul's influence over flesh. When rites were incomplete, or the deceased had lived beyond the protection of the Church, anxiety followed them underground. Unbaptized children, suicides, heretics, outsiders, criminals, those who died suddenly or violently, those who lived alone, those who inspired discomfort. These were the dead most often accused of rising. The vampire myth allowed communities to impose order retroactively, to explain suffering by linking it to moral failure. If disease spread after a questionable burial, it was not random, it was deserved. Someone impure had been allowed too close to the living. In this way, fear became discipline. The threat of becoming undead reinforced obedience in life. To stray too far from accepted behavior was to risk not only damnation, but transformation. The punishment was not abstract or deferred. It was immediate and visible. You would become what people already feared you were. This belief also exposed a deeper psychological impulse, the need to believe that the world is just, that suffering has cause, that catastrophe does not strike without reason. To imagine the vampire as a sinner returned was to protect that belief. It meant that horror followed rules, that transgression carried consequences, that the boundary between good and evil was enforced not only by God, but by the grave itself. But the cost of this belief was heavy. It turned difference into danger. It allowed suspicion to harden into certainty. Those already marginalized in life were denied peace in death. Their bodies were exhumed, violated, destroyed, not because of what they did after burial, but because of who they had been before it. Folklore became a tool of exclusion. The vampire was blamed for misfortune, but it was also used to justify it. Women who lived independently, foreigners who spoke differently, the poor who lacked proper rights, the sick whose bodies unsettled expectations. These figures were folded into the myth because they already existed outside protection. Death did not redeem them, it exposed them. Yet beneath the cruelty of this logic lay fear that was profoundly human. If sin could survive death, then morality mattered absolutely. There was no escape, no forgetting. The self was permanent. The grave did not erase identity, it amplified it. This idea was terrifying because it suggested that we are defined not by our intentions, but by how others remember us. That judgment does not wait for heaven. It happens here. The vampire, as moral revenant, was the embodiment of communal memory turned hostile. A life lived wrongly became a danger to the group, even after it ended. The body, rather than decaying into neutrality, was believed to carry that wrongness forward. In this sense, the vampire was not a supernatural being at all. It was a story about guilt, about what happens when a community cannot forgive, cannot forget, cannot absorb difference without fear. The undead sinner was a warning and a mirror, reflecting how quickly moral anxiety becomes violence. As centuries passed, theology softened, and law replaced folklore as the enforcer of order. But the pattern remained. We still associate danger with deviance. We still look for moral explanations behind catastrophe. We still ask who failed when something goes wrong. The vampire survives because this impulse survives. It is easier to believe that suffering comes from bad people than from chance. That misfortune has a face. That disorder is caused by those who do not belong. And so, the vampire was shaped in the image of suspicion. It was not born from the unknown, but from the judged, from the quiet certainty that some lives, even in death, are not allowed rest. In the end, sin that survives, death is not a story about the undead. It is a story about how communities decide who deserves peace and who does not. Because the most enduring horror was never that the dead might rise, but that judgment might follow us into the grave and refuse to let us go. Chapter 7. Night as a moral boundary. Night was never just darkness. It was a transformation. When the sun fell beyond the horizon, the world did not simply dim, it changed character. Fields became unfamiliar, forest paths dissolved into suggestion. Sounds travelled farther, meanings shifted, and certainty loosened its grip. In pre-modern life, night was not an extension of day. It was a different realm altogether. And it was there that the vampire belonged. In daylight, order reigned. Labour had rhythm. Faces were recognizable. Authority was visible. In the church, the market, the family home. But when night arrived, that structure softened. Fires burned low. Doors closed. The village folded inward, leaving the edges to silence and imagination. Darkness did not erase rules. It suspended them. This was when sins were committed quietly, when thoughts wandered where they dared not go in the sun, when the living lay still and vulnerable, suspended between waking and death. Sleep itself was a small surrender of vigilance, of will, of control. The vampire emerged from that surrender. Folklore placed it firmly in the hours without witnesses, not because it feared light, but because light belonged to morality. Day revealed, night concealed. What moved under the cover of darkness was assumed to move outside law, outside God's immediate gaze. The night was morally ambiguous space. In medieval belief, the cosmos was ordered vertically. Heaven above, earth in the middle, hell below. Darkness, however, felt like a horizontal rupture, a slipping sideways into uncertainty. It was the hour when spirits walked, when prayers were most needed, when the boundary between worlds thinned. People spoke differently at night, thought differently, feared differently. The vampire was imagined not simply as nocturnal, but as native to this altered state of being. It did not invade the night, it arose from it. Its movements mirrored the anxieties of the hour, quiet, indirect, unseen. This association was not arbitrary. Many deaths occurred at night. Fever worsened, breathing slowed. The dying often slipped away while others slept. To wake and find someone gone felt like theft, life taken while no one was watching. Night became complicit. Dreams, too, blurred reality. Sleep paralysis, nightmares, and waking visions were common in an age without explanation. Sensations of pressure on the chest, inability to move, the sense of a presence nearby. These experiences imprinted themselves deeply. Something had come in the night. The vampire gave that sensation a form. It explained why the night felt inhabited, why darkness pressed close to the bed, why exhaustion lingered after sleep, why fear did not fade with waking. And because night was already associated with moral danger, temptation, secrecy, indulgence, the vampire absorbed those qualities as well. It was not merely active after sunset, it was empowered by it. In darkness, conscience weakened, confession was delayed, surveillance ended. What was hidden could act freely. This belief shaped behavior. Curfews were enforced, night travel was avoided, doors were locked not just against thieves, but against the unknown. To be out at night without reason was to invite suspicion. Those who moved comfortably in darkness were already suspect. Witches, criminals, outsiders. The vampire joined this company easily because it embodied what the night represented: freedom from restraint, stripped of accountability. Yet the night was also intimate. Families gathered close, bodies shared warmth, breath mingled. It was a time of vulnerability, not isolation. The fear was not of the distant dark, but of what might enter the most private spaces. The vampire did not howl from the forest. It crossed the threshold. This made it more than a monster. It was a violation. The night, once meant for rest and restoration, became dangerous precisely because it was necessary. People could not avoid it. They had to sleep. They had to close their eyes. And so they imagined what might move while they could not see. The moral dimension of night intensified this fear. If day was aligned with God's order, then night felt closer to chaos. Not evil by default, but permissive. A time when unresolved desires surfaced, when the self was less guarded. The vampire thrived in this liminal state. It was not fully dead, not fully alive, not fully spirit, not fully flesh. Night mirrored its condition, neither one thing nor another, a suspended world where categories dissolved. This is why sunrise mattered so deeply in vampire lore. Morning was not just light returning, it was judgment, exposure, the reassertion of order. What survived the night had passed a test. What retreated belonged elsewhere. The vampire's power ended where visibility began, but the fear it represented did not. Because night as a moral boundary never disappeared. Even now we speak of things done in the dark. We associate secrecy with wrongdoing, night with danger, sleep with vulnerability. The symbolism endures because the experience endures. The vampire was not created by darkness. Darkness revealed what people already feared, that without constant vigilance, the rules that hold us together begin to loosen, that something watchful might step into the gap, that the unseen is not empty. In this chapter of the myth, the vampire became a guardian of that fear, a reminder that night is not neutral, that when light withdraws, meaning shifts, that what we suppress in daylight does not vanish, it waits. And so, when the sun fell and the world grew quiet, people listened, not for screams, but for movement, for breath where none should be, for the soft realization that in the absence of light, the world does not sleep. It watches, and sometimes it crosses over. Chapter 8. Rituals against the unknowable. When fear could not be reasoned with, it was acted upon. In a world where the causes of suffering remained hidden, people turned to the only language that felt reliable, ritual, not ritual as ceremony, but as intervention, a way to place hands on terror and force it into shape. The vampire, once believed to be real, demanded response. Stories alone were not enough. Prayer alone did not suffice. When illness lingered, when death returned too often to the same door, belief hardened into action. The living could not explain what was happening, but they could do something. And doing something mattered. The acts that followed, staking, decapitation, burning, are often remembered as cruelty, as barbarism. But to those who performed them, these were not gestures of hatred, they were measures of containment, logical steps taken in the face of the unknowable. When a threat cannot be seen, it must be made visible. The stake was not chosen at random. Wood carried symbolism older than doctrine. It was living material, once rooted, once growing. To drive it through a corpse was to anchor death back to the earth, to pin what wandered, to still what moved. The heart, believed to be the seat of desire and intention, became the focus. If the vampire fed because it wanted, then desire had to be destroyed. The stake was not a weapon, it was a restraint. Decapitation followed the same logic. The head was where identity lived, memory, will. To remove it was to sever purpose from movement. A body without a head could not return with intention. Fire, meanwhile, was final. It consumed without remainder. It purified by erasure. In a time when burial sometimes failed, burning offered certainty. Nothing could rise from ash. These rituals did not arise from sadism. They arose from pattern. Communities observed what seemed to work. When fear receded after intervention, when illness faded, when death slowed, the ritual was validated. Success was measured not by truth, but by relief. And relief reinforced belief. Psychologically, these acts served a crucial purpose. They restored agency. In the face of suffering that felt arbitrary and endless, ritual created a narrative of cause and effect. If the vampire was destroyed, the threat ended. Control returned to human hands. This was no small comfort. The rituals also followed a strict logic of boundaries. The vampire was believed to blur categories, life and death, body and spirit, inside and outside. Rituals, in response, were designed to reassert separation. Cut, burn, pin, divide. Each act clarified what belonged where. These practices were often communal. Entire villages gathered. Fear became collective, but so did responsibility. The burden of action was shared. No one stood alone with the horror. In this way, ritual transformed panic into cohesion. The body of the suspected vampire became a focal point, a physical object onto which anxiety could be projected and resolved. By acting upon it, the community acted upon its own fear. Modern psychology would recognize this instinct immediately. When humans face uncertainty, they reach for behavior, repetition, symbolic action. These create the feeling of safety even when certainty is absent. Ritual does not remove danger, but it removes helplessness. In vampire lore, helplessness was the true enemy. The violence of the rituals also reflected the intensity of fear. The more incomprehensible the threat, the more absolute the response. Half measures felt dangerous. If the dead could rise, then nothing short of total destruction would suffice. Ambiguity was intolerable. This urgency explains the brutality that followed suspicion. Bodies were mutilated not out of malice, but out of the need to be certain, to leave nothing that might return. Better to destroy completely than to wonder. And yet these rituals were deeply symbolic. They mirrored burial rites in reverse. Where burial closed the body, ritual reopened it. Where funerals honored continuity, these acts enforced finality. The vampire represented a failure of death. Ritual corrected that failure. But there was also something confessional in these actions. By performing them, communities acknowledged their fear openly. They admitted that prayer had limits, that belief alone did not protect, that sometimes survival required confrontation with what lay beneath the soil. In that confrontation, humanity met its own reflection. The rituals were not against the vampire alone. They were against uncertainty, against randomness, against the terrifying idea that suffering could occur without reason or resolution. By naming the threat and destroying it, people believed they had restored order. And order, even if illusory, was essential. As knowledge advanced, these practices faded. Science offered explanations that rituals never could. Disease was no longer blamed on the dead. Death itself became quieter, more distant. But the instinct remained. We still perform rituals in times of fear. We follow procedures. We seek closure. We destroy symbols of what threatens us. We act even when action cannot truly solve the problem, because action gives shape to dread. The rituals against the vampire were early expressions of this impulse. They were humanity's attempt to negotiate with the unknowable using the only tools available: symbol, violence, and belief. They remind us that superstition is not born from ignorance alone. It is born from fear paired with responsibility, from the unbearable weight of needing to protect others without understanding how. In the end, the stake did not kill the vampire. It killed uncertainty, or at least it pretended to. And in that fragile illusion of control, frightened people found just enough peace to keep living, one ritual at a time. Chapter 9. The outsider made undead. Every community draws a circle. Inside it are names, faces, shared customs, familiar prayers. Outside it lies uncertainty, language not understood, habits not shared, beliefs that do not align. In times of stability, that boundary can soften, but in times of fear, it hardens into something unforgiving. And when death entered the village too often, the circle tightened. The vampire did not emerge only from graves, it emerged from suspicion, from the quiet agreement that some people never truly belonged, and therefore never truly rested. Foreigners were the first to carry this burden. They arrived with unfamiliar accents, different food, strange clothing. They did not know the rhythms of the land or the rules of the community. Their dead were buried with different rites, their prayers spoken in other tongues. Difference in fearful times is easily mistaken for danger. When illness followed their presence, or misfortune clustered near their homes, the explanation felt ready-made. The outsider had brought something with them, something unseen, something corrupting. Even in death, that corruption was believed to linger. The vampire became the story that justified this fear. It explained why the unfamiliar felt threatening even when no harm was visible. It transformed discomfort into certainty. The outsider was not just different, they were dangerous. Heretics followed closely behind. Those who rejected the dominant faith, who practiced forbidden rites or questioned doctrine, unsettled the moral order. Their beliefs challenged the shared framework that held the community together. If faith was protection, then unbelief was exposure. When such people died, anxiety followed them into the ground. Without proper sacraments, without sanctioned burial, their souls were thought to wander. Their bodies, unguarded by ritual, became suspect vessels. The vampire myth gave this anxiety a form. It suggested that belief itself was a barrier between life and death. To exist outside it was to risk becoming something else, something that crossed back over. The socially unmoored were perhaps the most vulnerable of all, the poor, the solitary, those without family to speak for them, those who lived at the edge of town or at the edge of acceptability. They were seen less often, known less well, remembered less kindly. When something went wrong, they were easy to blame. The vampire allowed communities to erase these figures symbolically, to cast them out even after death, to say, "You were never truly one of us." In this way, folklore became a tool of social control. The undead outsider served as a warning: belong or risk becoming monstrous, conform or be remembered as a threat. Identity was not just about who you were in life, but how safely you fit into the group. Fear sharpened these distinctions. In times of plague, famine, or war, tolerance shrank. Survival demanded unity, and unity demanded sameness. Anyone who disrupted that sameness became suspect. The vampire gave permission to act on that suspicion. Bodies were exhumed not because of evidence, but because of identity. Graves of foreigners were opened more readily. The dead of heretics were scrutinized more closely. The socially isolated had fewer defenders when accusations arose. Once named, the label was difficult to escape. The outsider made undead was not a creature discovered by chance, it was chosen. This process reveals something unsettling about the myth. Vampirism was not always about fear of the dead, it was about fear of the living, of those who did not mirror the community's values closely enough to feel safe. Death did not absolve them. Instead, it froze them in their difference forever. Yet beneath this cruelty lay anxiety that was deeply human. Communities feared contamination, not just physical but cultural, the loss of coherence, the erosion of shared meaning. The outsider represented the unknown future, the possibility of change, the threat of fragmentation. By turning the outsider into a vampire, that threat could be contained, exiled, destroyed. The myth allowed people to believe that difference itself was dangerous, rather than confronting the fragility of their own certainty. And so, the undead outsider became a boundary marker, a reminder of where the circle ended, a story told to children about who they should avoid, what they should fear, and how they should live. But this boundary was never as stable as it appeared, because outsiders are not born, they are made. They are created by circumstance, by displacement, by loss, by the quiet accidents of history that place one person just far enough away from belonging to be seen as other. The vampire myth absorbed this complexity and simplified it into fear. In doing so, it preserved the illusion that danger came from outside the circle, not from within, that the community was whole and only threatened by intrusion. This illusion was comforting. It meant that if the outsider was removed, safety would return. Yet history tells a different story. Plague did not stop with exhumations. Famine did not end with ritual destruction. Death did not respect borders of belief or blood. The vampire endured because it offered something reality did not: clarity. It told people who to blame. And blame, once assigned, is difficult to relinquish. Even as belief in the undead faded, the pattern remained. Societies continue to mark outsiders as threats, to associate difference with danger, to imagine corruption arriving from elsewhere rather than emerging from within shared systems. The language changes, the fear does not. The vampire of folklore was an early expression of this impulse, a way to project collective anxiety onto those least able to resist it, to deny rest to the dead because the living could not tolerate ambiguity. In this chapter of the myth, the vampire was not a monster lurking in shadows. It was a mirror held up to exclusion, a reminder that fear does not only create legends, it creates margins. And those margins, once drawn, have a way of outliving the beliefs that formed them. The outsider made undead was not feared because they rose from the grave. They were feared because they had never been fully allowed to belong in life. And in the end, the most enduring horror was not that the dead returned, but that the living needed them to be monsters, so the circle could remain intact. Chapter 10. Love that refuses to die. Not all fears are born from hatred. Some rise from longing. In the quiet aftermath of death, when the rituals are complete and the mourners have gone, love does not disappear with the body. It lingers, unresolved, aching, searching for a place to go. In a world where death was sudden and frequent, grief was not a private experience, it was a constant companion. And sometimes it was unbearable. For those left behind, the absence of a loved one felt less like an ending and more like a wound torn open in the fabric of daily life. Beds lay half empty, voices went unanswered, the routines that once held meaning became reminders of what was gone. To imagine that love simply stopped was too much. So folklore offered another possibility, that love, like hunger or sin, might survive death, that it might move, restless and insistent, between worlds. The vampire, in some of its earliest tellings, was not a creature of malice, it was a revenant drawn back by attachment, a soul unwilling to release what it cherished, a presence that returned not to destroy, but to remain close. This idea was terrifying precisely because it was tender. Stories told of the dead visiting spouses, lovers, children, sitting beside them in the night, touching their faces, drawing near not out of cruelty, but desire. The living did not always resist. Some welcomed the visits, mistaking them for dreams, blessings, or mercy. But the cost was always the same. Strength faded, health declined, life thinned. Love, when it refused to die, became parasitic. These stories reveal something profound about early understandings of grief. Loss was not seen as clean separation. It was experienced as ongoing presence. The dead were felt in the house, in the fields, in the shared spaces of memory. To imagine them returning was not unnatural. What made it frightening was the realization that closeness could be dangerous, that love, unchecked by death, might consume the living rather than comfort them. In this way, the vampire myth explored a psychological truth long before it had language. Grief can be overwhelming. It can pull the mourner toward death, drain vitality, blur the boundary between holding on and letting go. The undead lover became a metaphor for mourning that refuses to release. In some traditions, the vampire returned to finish unfinished relationships, to consummate marriages never completed, to reclaim affection denied in life, to remain bound to the living through desire rather than blood. These stories did not cast the vampire as evil. They cast it as tragic. The dead were not punished for wrongdoing, but for loving too much, for being unable or unwilling to accept the finality of loss. Their return was not an act of defiance against God, but an act of devotion against reality. Yet devotion, when severed from mortality, becomes destructive. The living partner, drawn into the orbit of the undead, slowly faded. Night by night they were weakened by visits that felt intimate, familiar, and wrong. The vampire fed, not because it hungered for blood alone, but because proximity itself sustained it. Love became sustenance. This theme resonated deeply in societies where marriage, lineage, and inheritance defined identity. To lose a spouse was to lose stability, protection, and future. To imagine them returning, even briefly, was to imagine restoration. But restoration came at a price. Folklore warned that clinging too tightly to the dead endangered the living, that mourning had to end or it would become a kind of self-destruction. The vampire lover was the embodiment of grief that refuses transformation. It was a lesson told through fear. These stories also carried a subtle recognition of desire's power. Sexuality, intimacy, attachment, these were forces capable of overwhelming reason. To imagine them surviving death was to imagine vulnerability without limit. The undead lover did not seduce strangers. It returned to those already bound by affection. This made it more dangerous than any monster, because the threat came wrapped in familiarity, in tenderness, in memory. The living did not scream or flee, they opened doors. In this sense, the vampire was not an invader, it was invited. The myth forced communities to confront an uncomfortable truth. Love alone is not always life-giving. It can exhaust, it can bind, it can prevent healing. By turning love into horror, folklore created space for necessary separation. It taught that the dead must be released, not because they are forgotten, but because the living must continue. The rituals that followed such stories, burning the body, destroying tokens of attachment, severing the bond, were acts of mourning disguised as defense. They marked the painful acceptance that love cannot survive unchanged. Death demands transformation. Even now the image endures. The romantic vampire, drawn by passion, sustained by intimacy, reflects a fear that remains deeply human, that love might trap us in the past, that longing might hollow us out, that devotion, unchecked, could become fatal. The vampire born of grief is not a villain. It is a warning, a reminder that love, for all its power, must learn to let go. That memory must be carried forward, not allowed to return in the night. Because when love refuses to die, it does not remain pure. It becomes a shadow of itself. And those who cling to it too tightly risk joining it, half alive, half gone, suspended between what was and what must be. In the end, love that refuses to die is not a story about the undead. It is a story about the living, about the fragile, painful work of releasing those we have lost, and about the quiet terror that, if we do not, love itself may become the thing that consumes us. Chapter 11. The body as evidence. In the absence of explanation, the body became a witness. Long before anatomy was mapped and decay understood, the corpse was not silent. It was observed, scrutinized, interpreted. In villages where knowledge passed through story rather than study, the dead spoke a language shaped by fear, faith, and expectation. And the living listened closely. Every death left behind a question. Why this person? Why now? When answers failed to arrive from heaven or medicine, They were sought in flesh. The body was opened not by scalpel, but by suspicion. Its changes were read not as processes, but as messages. The corpse became a text. Skin told stories, bruises suggested struggle, darkened veins hinted at corruption beneath the surface. Blood at the mouth or nose was not understood as gravity or pressure, but as movement, as evidence that something had travelled where it should not. Decay was not neutral, it was narrative. Without the concept of natural decomposition, the body's transformations felt intentional. Swelling implied fullness, reddened lips implied feeding, stiffness suggested resistance. Every unfamiliar sign demanded meaning, and meaning was supplied by belief. Fear filled in the gaps. To exhume a body was to reopen a conversation with death. Those who did so were not searching for truth as we define it now. They were searching for confirmation. The corpse was examined not to learn what happened, but to validate what was already suspected. The question was never what caused this. It was who. This is how the vampire found its most persuasive evidence, not in stories told around fires, but in bodies pulled from the ground. The physicality of the corpse anchored the myth in reality. It made fear tangible. If the body looked wrong, then something must have been done to it, or by it. The living did not yet know that the human body changes in predictable ways after death, that gases expand the abdomen, that blood settles and darkens, that nails and hair only appear to grow as skin recedes. These transformations, natural and inevitable, were deeply unsettling when stripped of context. They mimicked vitality, and vitality in the dead was unforgivable. A corpse that looked too alive disrupted the moral order. Death was meant to reduce, to empty, to quiet. When it seemed to preserve, or worse, enhance the body, fear followed. The dead were not supposed to be active. This fear intensified in times of crisis. During plagues or famine, bodies were buried quickly and revisited often. Graves were shallow, soil was disturbed, animals interfered, weather altered remains. Each disturbance added another layer of confusion, and confusion demanded explanation. In these moments, the corpse was no longer just the remains of a person. It became a suspect, a piece of evidence in a case the community was desperate to solve. Was the heart intact? Was there blood in the chest? Did the body resist decay longer than expected? These questions were asked not with curiosity, but with urgency. Lives seemed to depend on the answers. The body was treated as a ledger of wrongdoing. Yet this reading was never neutral. It was shaped by who the deceased had been. A respected elder's body was forgiven its strangeness. A stranger's was not. A sinner's corpse was assumed guilty before it was uncovered. The interpretation preceded the observation. In this way, the corpse reflected not biological truth, but social truth. It revealed how communities projected anxiety onto flesh, how fear reshaped perception, how belief guided the eye. The vampire did not rise from the grave alone. It rose from interpretation. The body as evidence also reveals something deeper about the human need for causality. Death without meaning is intolerable. To accept that bodies decay unpredictably is to accept that life ends without narrative. So the corpse was turned into a story. Bruises became signs of struggle with the living. Dark fluids became proof of feeding. Rigor became resistance. Every mark was elevated from symptom to signal. This process was not malicious, it was instinctive. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We read faces, we read weather, we read signs into silence. When confronted with death's physical aftermath, we read that too. And when fear dominates, the story darkens. The practice of examining the dead for signs of vampirism was an early form of forensic reasoning. Flawed, incomplete, but deeply earnest, it was an attempt to ground terror in observation. But observation without understanding is a dangerous thing. It does not illuminate, it confirms. The corpse could not contradict the story told about it. It could only be shaped by it. This dynamic explains why vampirism flourished across cultures with different beliefs but similar fears. The details varied, but the method remained the same. Look at the body, decide what it means, act accordingly. The body, stripped of voice, became whatever the living needed it to be. Evidence of threat, evidence of guilt, evidence that fear was justified. And so, bodies were pierced, burned, dismembered, not because they had proven anything, but because they had failed to appear innocent. The physicality of these acts reinforced belief. Once the body was altered, it could no longer contradict the accusation. The evidence was destroyed along with the doubt. Closure was achieved through finality. As science slowly emerged, the corpse was reinterpreted. Decay was explained, processes were named. What once looked like feeding became fermentation. What seemed like growth became illusion. The vampire lost one of its strongest foundations. But the instinct to read bodies did not disappear. We still search for meaning in remains. We still look for causes in flesh. We still believe that the body tells the truth, even when we do not yet know how to read it. The difference now is language. In the age of folklore, the body spoke fear. In the age of science, it speaks data. Yet the desire is the same, to understand death by looking at what is left behind. The body as evidence is a reminder of how fragile interpretation can be, how easily fear shapes observation, how quickly belief fills the spaces where knowledge is absent. The corpse never lied, but it was never neutral either. It was a mirror, reflecting not what death is, but what the living fear it might be. And in those reflections the vampire found its most convincing form. Not in legend, not in imagination, but in flesh misunderstood and silence made terrifying by the stories we needed it to tell. Chapter 12. From folklore to fiction. There comes a moment in every myth's life when it leaves the village, when it steps out of the soil and into ink. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the vampire had begun to change. Not because fear had faded, but because it had learned new ways to speak. The world was shifting. Science named what superstition once guessed. Empires rose, cities grew, and death retreated from the center of daily life into hospitals, institutions, and statistics. But the vampire did not disappear. It adapted. Where once it had been a swollen corpse dragged from a shallow grave, it now acquired posture, vocabulary, intention. The undead crossed from oral tradition into literature, carrying centuries of anxiety with it, now refined, stylized, and dressed for an audience that believed itself more enlightened. The fears were the same. Only the language had changed. Folklore had been blunt. It spoke in hunger, disease, and corruption. Literature softened these edges without removing them. It made the vampire articulate, self-aware, capable of seduction rather than simple feeding. In doing so, it made the monster more unsettling. The literary vampire emerged during a time of contradiction. Rationalism flourished alongside repression. Industrialization brought progress, but also alienation. The body became disciplined, regulated, constrained by social norms that prized restraint over instinct. Desire did not vanish. It went underground. The vampire, once a metaphor for plague and decay, became a vessel for forbidden longing. Sexuality, power, transgression, all the urges polite society pretended not to feel, were transferred into the undead body. Blood was no longer just life. It was intimacy. The act of feeding became charged with meaning. It crossed boundaries of class, gender, consent. It was invasive, but also alluring, dangerous, but reciprocal. The vampire did not simply take, it tempted. This shift did not erase the old fears, it concealed them beneath elegance. Disease still haunted the image, the pale skin, the wasting victims, the sense of contamination through closeness. These remained intact, only reframed through romance rather than terror. The vampire was still about transmission, still about proximity, still about loss of control. But now, instead of villagers fearing an unseen threat, readers were invited to desire it. This was perhaps the most radical transformation of all. The monster became a mirror, not of collective panic, but of private repression. It asked readers to confront the parts of themselves that society demanded they deny: appetite, obsession, the wish to dominate or be consumed. The vampire offered transgression without consequence, at least on the page. Yet even in its refined form, the myth never fully let go of punishment. Those who embraced the vampire's world were often doomed. Seduction led to decay. Immortality came at the cost of isolation. Eternal life was portrayed as burden rather than gift. The old lesson remained: desire, when unbounded, destroys. What literature accomplished was not the sanitization of fear, but its reorientation. Instead of explaining sickness or death, the vampire now explored psychology, loneliness, alienation, the terror of living too long, remembering too much, wanting endlessly. Immortality became a curse shaped by memory. This evolution reflected a changing relationship with death. As medicine extended life and reduced mortality, fear shifted from dying too soon to living without meaning. The vampire embodied that dread perfectly, alive forever, yet fundamentally severed from human continuity. It could not age with others. It could not belong. The outsider returned, now immortal. At the same time, colonialism and globalization expanded awareness of the foreign. Cultures collided, identities blurred. The vampire, often depicted as aristocratic yet alien, carried echoes of earlier fears of outsiders, now filtered through fascination rather than rejection. The monster was no longer expelled. It was invited in. This invitation did not neutralize the threat. It internalized it. The vampire moved from the edge of the village into the drawing room, from folklore to fiction, from external danger to internal conflict. Readers no longer feared that the dead might rise. They feared what they might feel if they did. And yet, beneath the silk, the anxieties pulsed unchanged. Fear of contamination, fear of desire, fear of losing autonomy to something intimate and unseen. The vampire still fed on blood, because blood still meant life, still meant connection, still meant vulnerability. The act was dressed in romance, but its core remained invasive. It was still about being entered, still about being drained, still about being changed. What literature allowed was distance. Readers could engage the fear safely, explore it symbolically, taste the danger without risking the grave. The vampire became a controlled nightmare, one that could be closed with a book. But control is never absolute. The endurance of the vampire in fiction reveals that the old questions were never answered, only postponed. What does it mean to desire without limit, to live without end, to consume without consequence? Science could explain disease, it could not explain longing. The vampire survived because it migrated to where explanation could not reach, into the self. As the 20th century unfolded, the vampire continued to transform, becoming heroic, tragic, even sympathetic. Yet every version carried the same inheritance, the memory of graves that would not rest, of bodies misunderstood, of love that consumed, of boundaries crossed in the dark. Modern audiences may no longer fear the undead as real, but they still recognize the feeling, the pull towards something that promises fulfillment while demanding surrender, the terror of intimacy that costs too much, the fantasy of power entwined with loss. In this way, the vampire's journey from folklore to fiction was not a departure from fear, but its refinement. The myth learned how to speak to new anxieties while preserving the old ones beneath the surface. Silk replaced soil. Seduction replaced sickness. But the hunger remained, because myths do not disappear when they are explained. They change costumes. They follow us into new centuries. And beneath the elegance of the literary vampire, beneath the candle-lit rooms and whispered invitations, the same ancient dread still beats quietly, that something desires us not for who we are, but for what we contain, that surrender might feel like love, and that once invited in, some hungers never leave. Chapter 13. The Mirror That Still Watches. The vampire never truly left. It did not fade with superstition, nor dissolve under the weight of science. It did not retreat when graves were sealed deeper, or when illness was given names precise enough to strip it of mystery. Instead, it lingered, quietly adjusting, patiently waiting, because it was never only a creature of folklore. It was a reflection. From the beginning, the vampire carried the shape of human fear. Not a single fear, but many layered together, the terror of illness that steals life invisibly, the dread of desire that cannot be controlled, the unease of bodies that change without permission, the suspicion that identity does not end where flesh decays. These fears did not belong to the past. They were simply waiting for new language. As centuries passed, the world learned to explain what once inspired panic. Disease was traced to microbes, death was medicalized, the body became mapped, measured, and understood. The grave lost its power as a threshold and became a conclusion. And yet the vampire endured, because explanation does not erase experience. We no longer believe the dead rise to drink blood, but we still fear being drained, emotionally, physically, spiritually. We still speak of exhaustion as something that empties us. We still describe desire as consuming. We still imagine corruption spreading quietly through systems we cannot fully see. The metaphors remain because the feelings remain. The vampire adapted to this inner landscape with ease. It moved inward, shedding its literal body to become psychological. Where it once stalked villages, it now inhabits the self. It watches from the corners of modern anxiety, loneliness, addiction, obsession, alienation. It asks the same questions it always has. What does it mean to want endlessly? What happens when hunger outlives fulfillment? What part of us refuses to rest? The vampire reflects illness, not just of the body, but of the mind, compulsions that return night after night, desires that do not respond to reason, patterns that drain vitality without visible cause. The language of feeding and depletion still fits too well to abandon. In this sense, the vampire has become intimate. It no longer arrives uninvited. It is invited through curiosity, fantasy, identification. We recognize something of ourselves in it, the longing, the isolation, the quiet terror of being unchanged while the world moves on. Immortality, once feared, is now questioned with unease. To live forever is to outlast meaning, to watch connections dissolve, to become a witness rather than a participant. The vampire carries that burden. It embodies the fear that survival alone is not enough, that to exist without belonging is its own kind of death, that something human, memory, desire, identity, might persist beyond usefulness. This is why the vampire so often stares back at us. It is not hunting. It is waiting, waiting for recognition. The mirror it holds up is uncomfortable because it reflects contradictions we still live with. We desire connection, yet fear intimacy. We want power, yet dread losing control. We seek permanence, yet are haunted by the cost of enduring. The vampire lives in that tension. It has always done so. Even now, when the myth is openly fictional, its presence unsettles. We know it is not real, yet it feels familiar. Its logic makes emotional sense. Its hunger mirrors our own in exaggerated form. That familiarity is its true power. The vampire endures because it is not a warning about monsters. It is a warning about ourselves, about what happens when fear goes unnamed, when desire is denied, when grief is unresolved, when boundaries blur quietly rather than violently. The undead figure asks what we do with the parts of us that refuse to die, the habits, the memories, the longings that persist long after they should have faded. It asks whether suppression truly ends anything or merely buries it shallowly. The old stories knew the answer. What is buried without understanding as a way of returning. The vampire also reflects our uneasy relationship with the body. Even now we struggle to accept its limits. Aging feels like betrayal. Illness feels unjust. Death feels premature no matter when it comes. The idea that something human might outlive the body is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests continuity. Terrifying because it suggests unfinished business. The vampire exists in that unresolved space. It is the thought that something essential might persist without purpose, that identity might survive without direction, that desire might continue after meaning has drained away. And so we return to it again and again. Each generation reshapes the vampire to fit its fears, but never erases its core. It is always about hunger, always about boundaries, always about the cost of wanting more than life can give. The mirror still watches because we still look into it. We find reflections of our anxieties waiting there, quiet, patient, unchanged. Fear of contamination becomes fear of influence. Fear of illness becomes fear of exhaustion. Fear of the dead becomes fear of emptiness. The vampire shifts, but it does not leave. In the end, this is why the myth survives every explanation. Because it was never asking to be believed. It was asking to be understood. The vampire is not proof that people once feared the dead. It is proof that people have always feared themselves, feared the possibility that something within us, some appetite, some memory, some shadow of identity, might outlast the structures meant to contain it, that even when the body fails, not everything goes quiet. And so the mirror remains, watching as we change, watching as we explain and rename and refine our fears, watching as we tell ourselves we are beyond such myths, patient, unblinking, because as long as we hunger, as long as we fear loss, as long as we wonder what part of us might endure beyond flesh, the vampire will still be there, not as a monster in the dark, but as a reflection that refuses to look away.